Good afternoon. My name is Christy Sellers, and I would like to thank you for allowing me to speak at your Arkansas Department of Health Lunch and Learn for April. Today, we will be focusing on genetically modified foods and, in particular, discuss some of the pros and cons to new genetically modified food labeling requirements. Today, when I'm finished with my presentation, my objective is for you to have a better understanding of just what a genetically modified food is, why they are being produced, how they are assessed for safety, the common concerns about genetically modified foods, both human health and environmental concerns, the genetically modified food labeling laws in the U.S., the pros and cons of this labeling, and in the end, I hope this information will allow you to draw your own conclusions on GM food labeling and whether or not the consumption of genetically modified foods is right for you. Before we start discussing labeling, I think it might be important if we define just exactly what genetically modified or GM foods really are. According to the World Health Organization, genetically modified foods are foods derived from organisms whose genetic material, their DNA, has been modified in a way that does not naturally occur. This technology is often called modern biotechnology, gene technology, recombinant DNA technology, or genetic engineering. It allows selected individual genes to be transferred from one organism into another, and it can occur between non-related species. For a lot of us, the thought of genetic modifying, bioengineering food, or crossing species does not necessarily sound like a good thing. A lot of people wonder, why would we do this? What's wrong with conventional methods of food production? Well, genetically modified foods have been developed and marketed because there is some perceived advantage to the producer or to the consumer of these foods. For producers, this might mean improved crop production through increased levels of foods, resistance to disease and viruses, and an increased tolerance to herbicides. Between 1996 and 2012, we saw an increase of more than 370 million tons of food crops. One-seventh of the increased yield was attributed to genetically modified crops in the U.S. It is estimated that an additional 300 million acres of land would be necessary to grow that much food conventionally, so being able to meet the food needs of the world using less land is very appealing to a lot of people. In addition, genetically modified foods reduce production timelines to new strains. Conventional breeding of crops can take 10 to 15 years to result in the desired traits. Lastly, for producers, there is a believed economic benefit. From 2006 to 2012, the global increase in farm income from genetically modified food had reached $116 billion, almost triple that of the previous 10 years. About 42% of the economic gain was from the increased yield due to advanced genetics and resistance to pests and weeds. The decreased cost of production from reduced pesticide and herbicide use contributed to the remaining 58%. For consumers, it could mean better nutritional value and improved taste of foods. What you may not realize are what genetically modified foods are already being grown and have been introduced into the market for purchase. Here is a list of some of the items that are already available to consumers: apples, Argentine canola and Polish canola for canola oil, beans, eggplants, corn, melons, papaya, plums, potatoes, rice, soybeans, squash, sugar beet, sugarcane, sweet peppers, tomatoes, and wheat. There are over 100 other items being tracked as there is known biological engineering and testing of these products being conducted. Some of these products include oranges, pineapples, and mushrooms. You might be surprised to see some of these foods on the list. Do you know if you have purchased any of them? If not, that's okay. We will talk about ways to identify these foods a little later. So, are these genetically modified foods safe? Have they passed any sort of safety inspection or assessment? Most national authorities consider that specific assessments are necessary for genetically modified foods. Specific systems have been set up for the rigorous evaluation of GM organisms and GM foods relative to both human health and the environment. Similar evaluations are generally not performed for conventional foods. Hence, there currently exists a significant difference in the evaluation process prior to marketing for these two groups of food. The safety assessment of genetically modified foods generally focuses on direct health effects or toxicity, potential to provoke allergic reaction or allergenicity, specific components thought to have nutritional or toxic properties, the stability of the inserted gene, nutritional effects associated with genetic modification, and any unintended effects which would result from the gene insertion. The World Health Organization Department of Food Safety and Zoonosis aims at assisting national authorities in the identification of foods that should be subject to risk assessment and to recommend appropriate approaches to safety assessment. Should national authorities decide to conduct safety assessment of genetically modified organisms, who recommends the use of Codex Alimentarius guidelines? The Codex Alimentarius Commission, or Codex, is the intergovernmental body responsible for developing the standards, codes of practice, guidelines, and recommendations that constitute the Codex Alimentarius, meaning the International Food Code. Codex developed principles for the human health risk analysis of genetically modified foods in 2003. The premise of these principles is to perform a pre-market, case-by-case evaluation of both direct effects from the inserted gene and unintended effects that may arise as a consequence of insertion of the new gene. Codex principles do not have a binding effect on national legislation, but World Trade Organization members are encouraged to set their national standards with Codex standards. If trading partners have the same or similar safety assessments of genetically modified foods, the possibility that one product is approved in one country but rejected in another becomes smaller. Both the human health and environmental aspects are of concern, but I want to start by discussing the environmental issues. It is important to note that the environmental safety aspects of genetically modified crops vary considerably according to local conditions. However, the issues of concern generally include outcrossing, or the migration of genes from genetically modified plants into conventional crops or related species in the wild, as well as the mixing of crops derived from conventional seeds with genetically modified crops. The persistence of the gene after the GMO has been harvested, the susceptibility of non-target organisms such as insects which are not pests to the gene product, the stability of the gene, the reduction in the spectrum of other plants including loss of biodiversity, and increased use of chemicals in agriculture. Environmental safety assessments look at not only the GMO we are investigating, but also the potential environment receiving the GMO. The assessment process includes evaluation of the characteristics of the GMO and its effect and stability in the environment. The assessment also looks at unintended effects which could result from the insertion of the new gene. Although there have been many theoretical discussions that cover a wide range of possible health implications, the three main issues debated are the potentials to provide allergic reaction or allergenicity, gene transfer, and outcrossing again. Allergenicity. As a matter of principle, the transfer of genes from commonly allergenic organisms to non-allergenic organisms is discouraged unless it can be demonstrated that the protein product of the transferred gene is not allergenic. While foods developed using traditional breeding methods are not generally tested for allergenicity, protocols for the testing of GM foods have been evaluated by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Health Organization. No allergic effects have been found relative to GM foods currently on the market. Gene transfer. Gene transfer from genetically modified foods to cells of the body or to bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract would cause concern if the transferred genetic material adversely affects human health. This would be particularly relevant if antibiotic resistance genes, used as markers when creating GMOs, were to be transferred. Although the probability of transfer is low, the use of gene transfer technology that does not involve antibiotic resistance genes is encouraged. Outcrossing. Outcrossing can also be considered a health risk to humans because it may have an indirect effect on food safety and food security. Cases have been reported where genetically modified crops approved for animal feed or industrial use were detected at low levels in the products intended for human consumption. Several countries have adopted strategies to reduce mixing, including a clear separation of fields within which genetically modified crops and conventional crops are grown. On July 29, 2016, President Obama signed a bill amending the Agriculture Marketing Act of 1946 to require the Secretary of Agriculture to establish a national disclosure standard for bioengineered foods. The new law establishes the framework for the labeling of food products containing bioengineered or genetically modified organism ingredients. This new law is not set to take effect until July 1st, 2018. So what is this law supposed to do regarding labeling of the genetically modified foods? This law states that companies will be required to disclose the presence of GMO ingredients through text label, symbols, or digital links such as scannable QR codes. That is pretty straightforward. However, the amounts of such substances that the food may contain before requiring the label has not been determined. The Department of Agriculture has been given this task along with the task of determining what exactly the labels will look like. Associated Press has indicated that the law was largely supported by the food industry, which wanted to see a national standard rather than separate state standards that could vary. So we don't know much about what the labeling will really consist of yet, but from what we do know, you may be asking, what are the pros and cons to labeling genetically modified foods? So let's start with talking about the benefits of genetically modified food labeling. For consumers, there's consumer awareness. Consumers will be aware that the product they are buying and consuming contains a genetically modified organism. This could help an individual identify and avoid a possible allergic reaction. Modification of natural components can exacerbate allergy. One example of this is the production of soybeans enriched with the amino acid methionine. The enhanced synthesis of the amino acid is the result of a gene isolated from Brazil nuts. As a consequence, some consumers with an allergic sensitivity to these nuts have allergic reactions to the transgenic soybeans. Labeling would also be able to communicate if the nutritional value of the food had been changed. In Uganda, researchers are teaming up to bioengineer the cooking banana, the staple food of that country, to address vitamin A deficiency. These genetically modified bananas would contain an enhanced amount of beta carotene that would be converted into vitamin A by the body. Vitamins A, C, E, unsaturated fatty acids, alimentary cellulose, and probiotics are some of the specifically targeted nutrients for genetic modification. GM technology can also be used to facilitate food processing. This can increase the stability and shelf life of the product, meaning fresh fruits and vegetables that don't spoil as easy when the consumer gets them home. Genetically modified products are also being looked at as possible ways to enable the expression of viral or bacterial antigens in the edible portion of plant cells. In theory, this would allow modified foods to be able to serve as oral vaccines, capable of stimulating the immune system via mucosal immunity to produce antibodies. Currently, rice, corn, soybean, and potatoes are being studied for the use as potential bearers of edible vaccines against different infections, including E. coli toxins, rabies, Helicobacter pylori, and type B viral hepatitis. Without the labeling of genetically modified foods, it may be hard to know exactly what was modified and with what. With some types of vegetarians and with certain religious sects, some foods are to be avoided. Labeling the genetically modified food could help those wishing to avoid certain ingredients. Again, we don't know how much of an organism will be necessary in a product for it to be labeled, so it could mean that genetically modified food products would be avoided altogether by these groups of individuals, but at least they would have a way of identifying a food they may not want to purchase. Ethically, it is thought of as a way to keep animal DNA out of the foods. Consistency is another issue that a mandatory label would bring about. Not only would all products have to be identified, but the label would all be the same so the consumer would know what to look for. Another benefit is others are doing it. Currently, 64 countries around the world require labeling of genetically modified food organisms. Some of the major cons associated with genetically modified labeling include not all products will have to be labeled. Animal products and foods served in restaurants and other food establishments are exempt. Consumers will not be getting the whole story on a product. Just because a food is labeled as genetically modified, it will not tell the consumers what pesticides or herbicides were used. Additionally, states that already had genetically modified labeling laws in place only require a label if more than 1% of the product contained a genetically modified organism. Is that limit low enough? Will that be the limit established by the new law? There are still many questions concerning this issue that need to be answered. Other labels that identify non-GMO products are already in use if a person does not wish to buy, so it is viewed that it may be unnecessary. However, there is not a law requiring non-GMO products to be labeled. There is also concern, since animal products are exempt from labeling, that it could be confusing to consumers. An example, SpaghettiOs will be required to carry a GMO label. However, meatball SpaghettiOs will not, because it is a meat-containing product and will be regulated differently. This doesn't necessarily mean there are not genetically modified organisms in meatball SpaghettiOs, but if a consumer is not educated on the requirements, will they know they are buying and consuming a genetically modified food? And of course, there is concern over potential cost increases to products. The labeling alone could be an increased cost, but in addition, if companies decided to start swapping out ingredients from genetically modified to non-genetically modified to avoid being labeled, those ingredients could cost more and cost will be passed down to the consumer. As we mentioned earlier, certain canola oils are produced using a genetically modified crop. In one instance, that canola oil was replaced by olive oil, and it was estimated that the increase of the cost of the product was 10%. And although I did not list it as a con, there is also some concern that this swapping of ingredients could lead to a changed recipe that potentially has altered nutrient content, taste, or allergenicity. This is also a good time to note that small producers, those defined by FDA as having less than 500 employees, will have 1 year longer than larger companies to comply, and tiny food companies, defined as making less than 1 million in sales per year from human food, will be completely exempt. Here are some examples of what a non-GMO food label might look like. These various labels have been used to help consumers identify non-GMO foods. The one most commonly seen here in the US is the label on the bottom that the product is verified by the Non-GMO Project. A product with this label has been verified by GMO testing, which assures a product has been produced according to consensus-based best practices for GMO avoidance. In addition to that label, the USDA organic label may be found on products. Even though the USDA organic label does not state it is a non-GMO product, when this label is used, it certifies that no GMOs, chemical fertilizers, synthetic substances, irradiation, sewage, or sludge were used in the production of these USDA organic items. Here are some examples of what you might see in the grocery store today. I've tried to highlight the non-GMO labeling with a red circle. As you can see, some of the labels are the same and some are different. Since other countries already have labels for GMO products, here are some examples. This yellow tag that looks between a warning sign and a laundry label is what is used in Brazil. Currently, what we see in the US would be like the other two labels. As you can tell, the one label is for a salad dressing and clearly states it contains genetically modified soybean oil. The other label just says partially produced with genetic engineering, but does not list a particular food item that has been modified. And in case you were wondering, that product is peanut M&Ms. When shopping for fresh fruits and vegetables, we know they don't have a regular label to look at, so how do you know what you're getting? Every fresh fruit and vegetable has a PLU code, and that code does more than tell the register how to charge you at the store. If the PLU code is a 4-digit code and starts with a 3 or 4, then that product was grown conventionally. If the PLU code has 5 digits and starts with a 9, that product is organic. If there's a 5-digit code that starts with an 8, then that indicates the product has been genetically modified. So what do you think? Are genetically modified foods frankenfoods, or are they foods from heaven? Do you think they have more cause for concern or more benefits to the population? I can't answer these questions for you, but I hope the information I provided will help you make a more informed decision. I want to make sure and provide you with a list of all the references that were used to put together this presentation. There is an extreme amount of information available about GMOs out there, but beware that sources can be biased, as this is actually a very controversial topic. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your attention today. I hope that you have found this interesting and informative, and it will enable you to better understand what is taking place out there when it comes to genetically modified foods, and you can be looking for the details of the new law coming this summer. Thank you again.